The novice's fingers slipped on the tali beads as the archpriest struck the staff against the stone altar, and the chapel snapped to silence. Fear was not an accident in that night. It was the sacrament being counted aloud. The occult researcher heard the bid click a beat later and felt the meaning of the ritual land like a weight in his satchel. Fear was the currency of sanctity here, and he had come to look for exact measures. That fear became the central problem he would chase. It explained why townsmen bowed without asking why, and why magistrates tolerated a church that punished more than it healed. He watched from a shadowed transept, keeping the brass spectacles folded in his palm. He was mid-40s, pale olive, with a satchel that smelled of vellum and candle soot. He kept his notes flat to avoid sudden rustle. He moved only his eyes while the archpriest spoke. The archpriest's voice lowered, and the acolyte's breathing matched it. The novice scribe counted beads with white knuckles. The researcher felt a shift in himself, from academic curiosity to tight, physical caution, and that shift pushed him to stay through the rite rather than leave. The archpriest, at the altar, said a phrase the researcher had not seen in any catalogued liturgy. The phrase made the novice flinch and cough blood onto his sleeve. A hooded acolyte pressed a palm to the novice temple. The acolyte's hand came away wet. The congregation watched and learned how fear was measured and offered. The researcher took one small note. The wax around the sigil was scored in a pattern that matched the beads. After the service, the researcher stepped into the rain and did not run. He carried that bead pattern in his head and turned it into a question he could show on paper. How had the church turned a private reaction into public discipline? He had suspicion at first. That suspicion hardened into a working hypothesis by the time he reached the river bridge. He meant to find proof that the rite was engineered, not inspired. He had found a single fragment 2 days later in a climate-controlled archive beneath the university. The vellum unrolled under his fingertips, brittle at the edges and stained with a rim of red. He breathed in the smell of old glue and iron as he bent over the marginalia and read a sentence that named the practice. Fear consecrated is prayer. The note beside it showed a crude diagram of beads and wax, annotated in an abbreviated script. This discovery moved him from suspicion to a direct lead. He copied the sentence into his notebook in short lines. He wrote the date in plain numerals and then a list of immediate steps. Confirm provenance, trace custody, find living witnesses. He could not yet reveal the margin note to colleagues. He folded the vellum and slid it into his satchel behind brittle protective cloth. He felt a new emotion then, not only professional interest, but a tightening worry that this doctrine could extend beyond one chapel. A week later, on a narrow alley behind the chapel, rain had stained the stone, and the novice scribe stood with her hood pulled low. She kept the small codex wrapped in cloth under her tunic. She had ink on her fingertips and a bruise at the temple. She spoke in a voice that trembled but kept precise words. "I kept a copy," she said. "I cannot keep it here." "They mark anyone who speaks," the researcher replied with careful calm. "Give it to me. I will copy it and return it." The scribe lifted her chin and tried to hold eye contact. "Tell me what they taught," the researcher said. He named the archpriest. He named the room where the rite took place. He watched the scribe's jaw work. They taught that a startled soul is closer to the divine than one in comfort. She touched the string of beads at her waist, and her fingers left dark smudges on the cloth. She looked frightened and resolute at once. Her fear made her hands shake, and that trembling convinced the researcher she had been inside the rites. They moved the codex to a safe house that night. The researcher sat with oil lamplight and a line of copied glyphs on the table. The scribe unwrapped the little codex and spread 3 fragments. The paper smelled of herbs. She pointed to a diagram that matched the vellum's marginalia and said, "Each bead marks a threshold. Each threshold names a debt or an oath. To cross it, you must answer with fear." The researcher traced the lines with a fingertip and said, "And the wax pattern." She tapped it with her nail. It records intensity. The archpriest judges where to direct the sanction. They worked until midnight. The researcher read aloud short phrases, while the scribe translated scribal abbreviations. She murmured numbers, gestures, and line breaks that mapped to civic roles: merchant, bailiff, widow, child. She stopped and breathed fast when she hit a passage naming the town council. They took fear into commerce, she said. They used it for leverage. The researcher wrote the phrase down and underlined it 3 times. That external finding raised the stakes. The doctrine was not a closed liturgy but an instrument. News traveled quickly. Word reached the chapel that a fragment had been seen outside the rooms. The archpriest arrived at dawn with 2 iron, faced acolytes and a list of names. He walked across the courtyard with his staff and did not hurry. He stopped beneath the scriptorium window and called, "Bring the codex," his baritone carried. The scribe stepped from the shadows and the researcher stepped out beside her, under a stone arch. The researcher kept his voice level. "You will not touch her book," he said. The archpriest's eyes narrowed. "Who are you to demand that?" "The archpriest." He named the researcher and spat the name out like a test. The acolytes closed ranks. The scribe folded her hands over the codex and did not speak. The researcher put the vellum on the ground between them and pushed his spectacles up. "I demand proof of your doctrines used in civic coercion," he said. "I will show the council the codex or its copy." The archpriest tapped his pectoral and smiled without humor. "You do not know what you provoke," he said. They argued in short lines. "Bring the codex." The archpriest, "Hand it over." "No," the researcher said. "You will answer to the council if coercion is shown." "You betray your kind." The archpriest, "You betray us," the researcher answered. Acolytes shifted forward. The courtyard smelled of damp straw and iron. A town watchman peered from a narrow gate. At that moment, an alderman stepped from the doorway and looked at the codex on the ground. He ran his fingers along the binding and said, "If this reaches the wrong hands, our trade agreements will fall." He looked at the archpriest and then at the researcher. The town's pragmatic fear changed the dynamic. The archpriest took a measured breath and left without the codex, claiming he would consult the Holy Council. The researcher saw a new form of pressure. Municipal self-interest now guarded the church's secrecy. The investigator realized the mechanism reached past superstition into political economy. They retreated to the safe house and began to decipher the diagram in earnest. The researcher and scribe lit a single candle and spread out a map of the town. She placed beads on the map where major families lived. "Each bead aligns with an office," she said. "Each wax pattern names a punishment and a promise. Fear can be assigned." He watched her move the beads and place wax marks with precise fingers. Her actions were deliberate, the motions of someone who had rehearsed in private and then resisted. They found notations showing how to escalate dread. A slip of vellum listed steps. Begin with a public shaming, follow with a private rite, then apply a civic sanction. The researcher read the line aloud. Public shaming, private consecration, civic sanction. He looked at the scribe. "They experimented with a sequence," he said. She nodded and began to recite a phrase from memory. She spoke in short lines. "They trained judges to be uncertain," she said. Then the church named the outcome. Her voice tightened and then steadied. The researcher marked the phrase as a mechanism rather than a belief. They decided to attend the public demonstration the archpriest planned in the market square. The day was bright, and the market smelled of bread and livestock. The archpriest stood on the steps before the town hall and called a man forward, a common townsman whose debts were known. The researcher kept his distance behind a merchant's stall and watched the ritual from an oblique angle. He had lined up 2 observers to confirm later that the rite matched the codex. The archpriest placed the staff on the man's shoulder and spoke in measured cadence. The acolytes circled with small mirrors, and the beads were held toward the man's chest. The man began to shake and then doubled over. People in the crowd stepped back. Someone at the back cried out. The researcher rotated his head and said the name of the townsman to his notebook in a clipped whisper. The townsman collapsed, and a hush fell like a lid. The magistrate looked to the archpriest and nodded once, a public show of deference. After the collapse, the archpriest proclaimed the man cleansed and declared a penalty that relieved him of a small debt in exchange for a public oath. The crowd accepted it. The researcher felt a cold clarity. He had expected the right to coerce, but he had not expected the precise exchange of fear for civic favor. That exchange explained why leaders tolerated the church. Fear produced obedience, and obedience paid in social order. That night the researcher and scribe argued over next steps. "We can publish this," the researcher said. "We can show the council the codex and force action." "If you show the council," the scribe said, "they will find someone to protect the archpriest. They fear disorder more than anything." He paused and ran a hand along his jaw. He kept his voice low. "Then we need another approach. We need to trace where else they practice this. If towns link this pattern, we can map the mechanism." Her fingers tightened on the codex. He set out a plan and they moved. They recruited 2 merchants to check trade notes, a barber who kept civic gossip, and a single retired sheriff who had once broken an oath for money. Each person gave them a clue, each clue a small outward event. A ledger missing entries, a sealed letter opened, a quiet threat implied in a tax demand. The network formed like a stitch pattern across the county. The researcher catalogued each item with a numbered line and a short phrase. The scribe copied symbols into a fresh sheet. One night, a messenger came with an urgent note. The archpriest had announced a midnight ritual in the old crypt beneath the chapel. The researcher felt his hands go cold in a way that made his breathing shorter and quicker. He packed the scorched vellum and the codex fragments into his satchel. The scribe's face went pale and she whispered, "They will use her." They moved toward the chapel in the lantern light. They entered the crypt before dawn. Stone steps led to a low chamber lined with niches. The researcher set the codex on a flat slab and lifted a small lamp just high enough to read marginal notes. The archpriest arrived with acolytes in a slow procession. He spoke and the acolytes formed a ring. The scribe sank to her knees beside the slab. The researcher stepped forward and held the codex up. "This is evidence," he said in a blunt voice. The archpriest answered with a ritual gesture that quieted the room. He placed a hand on the scribe's shoulder and read words that mirrored the codex. The scribe's breathing shortened. The acolytes closed an invisible circle and raised candles. The archpriest called the congregation's names aloud and then said, "We correct what is broken." He lifted the staff and made a small, deliberate strike against the slab. The scribe went rigid and would not speak. The researcher moved to place his hand on her wrist, but an acolyte blocked him. A rapid fight erupted when the researcher tried to snatch the codex away. Acolytes moved like trained sentries. The archpriest chanted a phrase and the scribe's face slackened into a look of pure, physical terror. The researcher lunged and knocked the staff sideways. Metal rang. The acolytes closed in. A rapid exchange of shoves and grunts followed. The researcher managed to tear a page loose from the codex, and the archpriest struck the lamp so that wax fell onto the page and burned a corner. "Give that back." The archpriest barked, "Stop him." The acolytes answered with short commands. The researcher shoved a torn page into his satchel. The scribe, frozen, could not move her hands. One acolyte seized her by the wrist, and another advanced toward the researcher with a ritual knife. The researcher shoved the acolyte aside and ran for the side tunnel. He heard the archpriest call his name like a verdict. He plunged into the dark, and the cold stone pressed to his shoulders. He escaped through a narrow passage and out into a lane that led to the river. He ran until his lungs burned and then crossed the wooden footbridge. He opened his satchel and looked at the scorched page in his hand. The writing was partly lost, but a line remained. A ledger of assignments, names matched to beads. He understood then that the church had a list of targets and outcomes. He forced his fingers to steady and began to copy the legible words into his book. At the river crossing he found the scribe waiting, wrapped in a shawl and holding a small bundle. She had a smear of wax on her temple. She nothing for a long breath. Then she handed him the bundle. "Take what you can," she said, in a voice that trembled, and then steadied into resolve. "Go where the names point. Find the pattern." He took the bundle and felt the weight of decisions pressing on him. He had escaped the crypt with damaged proof and a single path to follow. In the dawn light, he set the scorched codex on the bridge rail and made precise entries into his notebook. He numbered the places mentioned and matched them to the merchant's ledgers. He wrote quick, plain notes on how the wax patterns correlated to civic favors. He felt a change inside. Fear had pushed him to act, anger sharpened into purpose. He was tired, his hands stained with ink and wax. But he had a plan to follow the mechanism through neighboring towns. He left the scribe by the river with instructions to disappear into a cousin's house and to send word only by the merchant who had already agreed to travel. "Do not come back here tonight." He nodded and climbed the bridge steps. The chapel's silhouette receded. He folded the scorched page into protective cloth and closed his satchel. The chapter closed with a concrete choice. He would not publish the fragment immediately. He would not confront the council with partial proof and risk the codex disappearing. He would trace the pattern, gather ledgers, and then present a map so undeniable that civic leaders could not ignore it. He resolved to follow the mechanism rather than retreat. He placed the codex fragments beside his notebook, tightened the satchel strap, and walked east toward the next market town, leaving the river and its wet stones behind. Outside the town, a cart creaked onto the road. A merchant lifted his lantern and called the researcher's name in a low voice. The researcher turned and listened. The next step had arrived, tangible and immediate, and he tightened his grip on the satchel as he walked toward it. A torch flared against linen. A sentry hauled the novice by the sleeve and exposed the vellum hidden beneath the tunic. Suspicion tightened the occult researcher jaw as he crouched on the shadowed stair and watched the sentry press the vellum flat against the torchlight. The hall filled with sudden noise, footsteps, a low murmur, and the immediate problem presented itself. A forbidden manuscript in a novice's hands would mean interrogation, possibly ritual punishment, certainly a threat to the codex's survival. He moved a fraction closer, keeping his satchel's leather seam pressed to the stone, measuring the distance and the chance for interference. Within the first minute, the researcher catalogued the stakes. Destroy the vellum and the doctrine remains sealed, allow it to pass and the church's doctrines could leak beyond the cloister. He recognized the face of the novice scribe in the torchlight, sallow skin, dark hair pressed back, ink under his fingernails, and understood that the boy's rescue would require an immediate choice under pressure. The scene was concrete. The danger was physical. The sentinel's hand tightened on the vellum. "What is that?" The sentry demanded, a scrap of common prayer. The novice, voice tight, "I was only carrying it to the scriptorium." He tried to wrench free. The sentry kept a grip at the elbow and turned the vellum so the burnished initial caught the flame. The researcher registered the gilt illumination, and beneath the gold leaf, the cramped marginalia curled like a secret inscription. He had come for proof, but now he feared exposure would destroy the material he needed. He shifted his weight, and the stairstone whispered. The sentry's head snapped toward the sound. The novice's eyes darted up and met a face in the stair. The researcher let the stair shadow swallow him again and counted the beats between heart and breath as preparation. He had felt this particular fear once before, the bead clicking in chapter 1 when the archpriest struck the altar and the chapel snapped to silence. And he stored that memory with the same care he applied to fragile folios. He remembered the bead's sound precisely and used that recall to temper the movement of his hand. The sentry barked in order. 2 acolytes arrived, their sandals slapping the flagstones. The researcher watched the novice swallowed by a growing ring of bodies. He could not intervene openly. His presence must remain a reportable rumor if discovered. He listened instead. The novices breath fast, the sentries muttered curses, the rustle of robes. The immediate event, discovery of the vellum, moved the plot into motion. The researcher noted the vellum's binding stitch, the dark crimson ink, and a sketched sigil erased partly by damp. He recorded those details with his eyes so he could later place them against other marginalia. They dragged the novice toward the antechamber. The researcher followed at a measured distance. Outside the chapter house, a cold draught cut across his face, and the torchlight blinked. The archpriest of dread arrived as they opened the antechamber door, his robes falling like a heavier shadow, and his iron pectoral catching flame. He moved with the restraint of a man who had practiced silencing rooms. The acolyte let go of the novice's arm and stepped back. The researcher kept to the stair, head tilted, notebook pressed to his chest. "Bring the vellum," the archpriest. His voice lowered and the room obeyed. He took the scrap from the sentry and flattened it on the table with 2 slow fingers. The parchment revealed a thin column of script and marginal notations that did not match the church's usual rubric. The archpriest's expression tightened as if the vellum were a wound. "You withheld it." The archpriest, the novice. "You smuggled doctrine under habit." "Why?" The novice swallowed. "It is," he began. "Name it." The archpriest interrupted. "Do not hide behind fear," his eyes fixed on the vellum, and then on the novice. "Speak." His small gestures carried ritual weight, and the novice's voice shrank under a look. The room's air held authority enforced by posture and by the knowledge that the archpriest could call any term heresy and make it stick. The novice's reply came as a brittle line. "I copied notes. I thought to study them alone." He put his fingers to his chest as if to protect the cloth beneath. "I did not mean treason." The archpriest did not accept the line. He moved to the window and watched the courtyard, the twilight gone to grey. "Secrecy is not simple privacy," he said. "It is sacrament. You treat secrecy like a coat to be taken off. That is treason." Acolytes flanked him. The researcher watched the archpriest's jaw, the ritual scars along it, the way he weighed each syllable as law. The archpriest offered the novice a choice in the chapel annex: confined discipline or a public rite meant to convert fear into obedience. He framed the options as theological, but the researcher heard coercion. The novice's hands trembled when the archpriest set down the ritual staff and let the melted candles drip along its shaft. "Recant," the archpriest. "Accept discipline and the order continues. Refuse and the cleansing will happen before all." The archpriest's measured cadence quieted the room. His voice alone had often ended arguments. The novice's eyes flicked to the archpriest and then to the doorway, where the researcher stood in shadow. The boy's lips moved without sound. The researcher stepped backward, weighing intervention against the greater goal: exposing the doctrinal mechanics of fear. He had come to trace pattern, not only to rescue one manuscript. He remembered the bead from the cold altar and felt the connection. The archpriest counted fear and assigned value. The choice before the novice was not merely punishment, it was an instrument. While counsel and whispers argued the novice's fate, the researcher found a gap in the cloister schedule and slipped into the scriptorium. The secret scriptorium alcove smelled of damp glue and old ink. He worked by a thin shaft of moonlight that came through a narrow slit. A single lamp burned low at the desk where he crouched, and the vellum he unrolled sat small in his hands. He had to move quickly. The antechamber's voices rose to occasional shouts, and he could hear footsteps from the chapel. He opened the codex and his fingers found marginalia scrawled in a cramped hand. A table of tallies, numeric glyphs beside lines that read like instruction. The marginalia described measuring fear by a series of provocations, counting responses, and amplifying dread through architectural placement and timed gestures. The researcher traced a column with his fingertip, noting numbers, a cipher, and an underlined phrase that named a ritual stage. The entry was precise and mechanical. It gave doctrine the appearance of engineering. He felt a shift in what he thought the church practiced. The margin converted piety into a system. A door groaned. He ducked his head and pressed the codex flat. A stool scraped. He heard a voice close by. "Who goes there?" He did not answer. The scriptorium's aperture fogged as a candle passed. The researcher held the marginalia to himself and breathed shallowly. He recognized the handwriting as the novice with its small, nervous loops. That fact changed the meaning. An insider had been recording methodology rather than theology. He slipped a page free, a folio thin and folded, and wrapped it in cloth. As he tied the knot, his hand brushed a smear of crimson ink, not dry but tacky at the edge. A sudden thought, betrayal or revelation, struck him. If this marginalia reached the wrong hands, the archpriest would call it blasphemy. The researcher measured risk. He could expose the piece now in the antechamber or hold it until the public cleansing and use it to confront doctrine before witnesses. He chose the latter. He retreated with the folio pressed to his chest. In the chapel the public cleansing began. Candlelight pooled under vaults, and the congregation pressed into benches. The archpriest mounted a low dais, and the novice walked forward, hands empty but for a thread of prayer beads repurposed as a tali. The researcher took a position in shadow near the rear, the stolen folio heavy under his cloak. He watched the novice's shoulders, the way he kept his gaze lowered. A dozen acolytes ringed the altar like silent sentries. The archpriest spoke a liturgy of fear that the researcher had heard in fragments before. "Fear binds the heart to truth," he intoned, "embrace it, and you will not stray." The congregation echoed key words, not loudly but with rehearsed breaths. The novice obeyed the ritual motions, moving through prostrations with hands that trembled. The researcher noticed the ritual choreography. A timed pause where the archpriest tilted his head, an incense breath, a ripple of light across a sigil. Those moments matched the marginalia, a list of provoked responses. At the rite's peak, the novice hesitated. His fingers slipped on the tali beads, and he froze with his forehead nearly touching the stone. The archpriest's eyes narrowed. The researcher stepped from a shadow and held the folio up so those closest could see the cramped marginalia. He called out, voice even and low. "Look at this." The folio caught a wick's blaze, and the congregation turned as one. The novice looked up at the researcher, mouth open, and the archpriest's jaw hardened into a practiced blade. The archpriest's response was immediate. He reached with a long, controlled motion for the folio, and the acolytes moved to seize the researcher. "You would break the sacrament in its hour," the archpriest demanded. The researcher felt 3 hands clamp his shoulders and a fist press his satchel. He did not speak beyond the single sentence he had prepared. "Read what you wrote." He held the folio out so the archpriest's fingers brushed the ink. A short exchange cut through the chapel. "Who wrote this?" "The archpriest. Who taught you these measures?" The researcher nodded toward the novice. The archpriest's voice dropped so the congregation had to lean in to hear. "You, novice," he demanded. "I." The novice's jaw worked. "I copied it at night, archpriest. I wanted—" He broke off as an acolyte stepped forward and shoved him. "Novice, do you confess?" The archpriest. The novice stammered, "I confess I read it. I confess I wrote notes. I did not intend harm." At least 3 acolytes moved to hold the researcher. A young attendant yanked the folio free, and the ink smudged at the corner. The archpriest slammed the folio onto the altar, and the congregation's murmurs rose. An acolyte hissed, "Burn it. Burn it now." Another gestured toward the door. 6 rapid lines of exchange followed between the archpriest and the researcher as the archpriest sought to reassert control. "You would take doctrine from us." The archpriest, "You would spread our practices to others." The researcher answered, "These are measurements, not prayers." The archpriest retorted, "Measurements sanctify the rite." The researcher, "Then show the tali." The archpriest snarled, We do not display our means. The researcher replied, Then you preach obedience without reason. The archpriest's fists tightened. Acolytes shifted with him. The chapel turned violent. The archpriest ordered the guards to seize the researcher. Acolytes closed ranks and the novice ducked his head. The researcher felt the iron of the pectoral press behind him as hands hauled him to the circle before the altar. He saw the archpriest draw his staff and gesture. The congregation leaned forward, a collective intake of breath. The researcher knew this moment was the chapter S fulcrum. The marginalius exposure forced doctrine from the realm of belief into the realm of demonstrable practice. A member of the congregation lunged for the folio and a scuffle broke out. The researcher twisted and slipped a hand under his cloak, finding the tied folio and the tied knot that held it. He had planned for distraction. The scuffle served. He pushed the folio into the novice's tunic in a motion quick as a prayer, and the boy flinched. The archpriest slammed a palm down, and the room obeyed silence. The archpriest roared, "You would cause discord." Several voices rose in agreement. The researcher felt the weight of hands at his shoulders as they dragged him forward for punishment. He did not resist. His aim had shifted. He let the archpriest place him at the circle, and the acolytes form the outer ring while the congregation watched. The novice kept his eyes on the floor. The archpriest declared the cleansing. He set the staff's melted candle to the folio on the altar. The flame licked the manuscript's edge and smoke rose with a smell of singed glue and vellum. That scent made the researcher grip his satchel strap as if to hold the folio's memory in place. He watched ink curl and a letter blacken and peel. A sudden shove from the rear broke the orderly pattern. The novice seized a moment and lunged forward, shoving between acolytes. "Stop!" he cried. "Stop this!" He clutched at the singed folio and wrestled it from the altar as a fresh ring of hands closed around him. The archpriest's pupils narrowed to 2 steely points. The chapel erupted into a series of rapid exchanges. "Novice," the archpriest in that hollow baritone, "do you defy the church now?" "I will not watch it burn." "The novice, this is doctrine. People should know." Acolytes pushed and pulled. The researcher seized that instant to speak with higher volume. "Read the marginalia," he demanded. "Read what it says about counting fear." The archpriest slapped the folio down and the page flipped under fingers. Hands clamped down on the researcher and the novice both. The archpriest read aloud a line in a voice that tried for neutral cadence. Stage 1. Domestic discomfort. Stage 2. Public embarrassment. Stage 3. Ritualized dread. The congregation's breath sucked inward. The archpriest looked up and his gaze snagged on the researcher's face. For a heartbeat the 2 men measured one another. The archpriest answered exposure with a display of doctrine intensified. He ordered the acolytes to take those who had moved against the ritual and bind them. Several members of the congregation who had stepped forward in curiosity were roughly shoved back to their benches. The archpriest proclaimed public penance for the novice and corporal discipline for the researcher. He used the moment to present a spectacle. Fear in motion must be visible and controllable. In the chaos that followed, the novice found a pocket in his cloak and slipped half of the folio inside. He glanced at the researcher and mouthed a quick, silent line. "Take it." The researcher felt the acolyte's hands pin his shoulders, and, with a practiced motion, he closed his fist around the cloth, wrapped page pressed against his chest. He could feel the folded folio's edges and the smear of ink through the cloth. The archpriest bellowed an order, and the acolytes dragged the researcher to the nave. They moved through the nave to the cold cloister. The morning pushed pale light between columns and the courtyard lay empty except for a single stone path streaked with candle wax. The archpriest announced the disciplinary actions to a half-assembled group of senior acolytes. The researcher stood with hands bound and watched the novice's face as orders were given. The boy's lips were set. He did not beg. He had become an agent rather than a passive subject. At a side stair the novice slipped from formation and came close enough to whisper. He pressed a small wrapped packet into the researcher's hand. "Hide it," he whispered, "smuggle it out. Tell them I took it." His fingers brushed the researcher's palm. There was a smear of ink and dust. The researcher felt a sudden shift from suspicion to a new current of resolve. The bargain was risky, but the marginalius concrete system needed to be seen by others beyond the cloister. The novice action changed the stakes. The boy moved from defendant to conspirator. The researcher assessed escape routes and the archpriest's attention. He could note a dozen doors, a pair of cloistered passages, and the service entrance used by the kitchen staff. He felt the acolyte's hands slacken for a moment as the archpriest lectured on obedience, and he used that loosening to tuck the packet further into his satchel. The acolyte nearest him, named Alden, glanced up and caught his eye. Alden's face was young, but his expression held the quick calculation of someone who could be persuaded. Alden, the researcher, under his breath. "Help me move the crate near the west door at dawn." He kept his voice low and factual. Alden hesitated, then nodded once. That exchange, 3 words, a nod, constituted a small conspiracy among secondary characters. Alden's choice mattered. He would either help create cover or betray them. The researcher had turned a passive observer into an active plotter. By dawn, the cloister stones were washed with a thinning fog, and the service entrance creaked open for deliveries. The archpriest kept watch by the chapel threshold and maintained a tight circle of acolytes. The researcher moved with a limp he adopted for the moment and a satchel snagged at his hip. Alden walked nearby carrying a crate. The researcher kept his breathing even and his hands inside his sleeves. At the chapel threshold, as pale light warmed the stone, the researcher felt for the tali beads in the novice's hand and noticed one missing from the thread lying on the chapel step. He had remembered the first chapter's bead click at the cold altar and now saw a concrete trace. A single bead absent from the novice's tali. That absence proved that fear had been counted and could not be entirely returned. The researcher slipped through the proffered route with Alden at his side, and the crate blocking sight lines just long enough for him to pass into the courtyard. Outside, he pressed his palm against the folio packet and felt the dryness of folded vellum. The morning smelled of cold stone and boiled porridge wafting from the kitchen. He and Alden exchanged 2 quick phrases about timing. Alden left, face composed, and the researcher moved toward the city gate, where a contact waited to receive the stolen folio. He did not look back toward the cloister. He had to keep moving. The chapter closed with action rather than reflection. The researcher walked through the gate with the folio strapped to his chest, the cloth damp at its edges from a smear of ink, and at the chapel threshold a single tali bead lay on the cold step, where the novice had left it. He inched his fingers to touch it, and the touch fixed the night's events into material proof. Fear had been counted, rituals had been mechanized, and a pact had been struck to move the codex beyond the archpriest's control. The concrete object, 1 bead, 1 folio, anchored the outcome. The researcher adjusted his satchel strap, stepped into a narrow lane, and slipped the bead into a pocket of his coat as he continued away. The stolen folio still bound to his chest. Emotion roots, suspicion. Emotion shifts, suspicion, urgency, resolve, confrontation, fragile hope. The novice scribe had one hand on the bell rope, and the codex tucked under the other when the archpriest stepped out of shadow and demanded the book. Suspicion tightened the occult researcher's jaw as he heard the archpriest's voice cut across the rooftop. "Give it here." That single urgent command made the problem unmistakable, betrayal within the cloister, and the codex itself as proof. The rooftop wind bit through the scribe's tunic. The researcher, leaning behind the belfry's low parapet, felt suspicion drive his choice to descend rather than flee. The occult researcher moved down the stone stair with measured steps, leather satchel strapped, brass spectacles catching a thread of pre-dawn light. He knew the novice scribe's habit of hiding vellum beneath garments. He had seen the tali beads click during the cold altar. Felt the significance of that count in the chapel, the bead click after the staff struck, and had crouched on the shadowed stair while a torch revealed the vellum in the hall. Those two concrete moments had taught him how this order kept secrets. He kept his hands free so he could take the codex if the novice had to hand it off. He kept his breathing steady so the archpriest would not hear him first. The archpriest of dread did not raise his voice. He lowered it until the rooftop seemed to hold its breath. "Novice," he said, "you bind us with theft." "Give the book." The archpriest's baritone landed on the phrase theft like a verdict. His hand rested on the iron staff. The novice scribe's fingers closed tighter around the codex and then opened. A small, trembling decision. "Archpriest," the voice from below said. It was the occult researcher stepping into the light between the bell and the slate. Spectacles straight, satchel visible. "Do not take that without witnesses." He set his tone to that of an examiner, not an accuser. That choice, investigate rather than attack, came from suspicion shaped by past signs. The archpriest's eyes narrowed. "You were not summoned, researcher." "Step back." The novice looked between them, eyes wide, ink smudges visible at his fingertips. The rooftop confrontation forced movement. The novice scribe climbed down by the east stair, while the archpriest followed the parapet, his robes whispering. A distant bell in the town struck twice. The sound marked time and made every step audible. The researcher reached the ruined cloister before dawn, codex safely hidden within the novice's tunic, and a sentry's torchlight threw a streak of yellow across the cracked stone. The planned transfer in the ruined cloister had been simple. The novice passes the codex to the researcher at a broken column, then the researcher takes the codex to a safe place. They had counted on secrecy. The archpriest's men moved faster. The senior acolyte's boots hit the flagstones and a voice barked, "Hold." The researcher stepped forward and raised one hand to show empty fingers. "Give it over." The senior acolyte. His mouth was tight, his eyes on the novice. The novice fumbled, and the codex slipped partway from cloth bindings. The torchlight revealed the folios. The vellum split between them. The researcher had one section pressed against his chest, while the archpriest's men clutched the other. The exposed pages bore marginalia and circling marks of ritual procedure, an instruction on counting dread into consecration. The researcher tucked his portion under the leather flap of the satchel and stepped behind a broken column. "We keep this hidden because it kills people," the novice whispered. His voice was thin but steady enough to push the moment forward. "They count fear, and then they make it holy." The researcher listened. Suspicion curdled into a colder feeling, fear, but it was a precise fear, the recognition of danger that could be documented. The senior acolyte's face moved like a closing door. "This is treasonous," he said to the archpriest. "We must purge the heresy." The archpriest responded with a measured phrase meant to command a crowd. "Purification will be public tonight." The plan to make the revelation spectacle formed before the sun fully cleared the horizon. The researcher understood the stakes. If the archpriest controlled the narrative now, he would bind fear back into authority. They split apart under the ruined vaults, and the researcher and novice slipped away through narrow coils of alley while the archpriest's men moved to secure the cloister. The novice walked with a limp, thumb pressed to a bruise at his temple. Each step toward the hidden cell was punctuated by the novice fidgeting with his prayer, bead tali. Doubt shifted to determination in the researcher. Suspicion had turned into urgency. He would piece together the procedure by lamplight in the underground chamber. In the hidden cell beneath the library, a single lantern threw a pool of amber across a blanket of folios. The researcher spread the recovered fragments on the table, aligning inked lines against one another. He read aloud short Latin fragments so the novice could confirm. "Count the woe, mark the pulse, bind the number to the name." The novice drew shallow breaths and traced letters with a finger stained by ink. "Who wrote these notes?" the researcher asked. He knew the archpriest's hand from marginal cuts seen in other notes. The archpriest added those marks. The novice. He pointed to a thin vertical mark near the throat of right. The researcher recognized the same ritual scarred shortened from the archpriest's ceremonial pages. The first emotion shift, suspicion to fear, became suspicion to a new clarity. Betrayal. That recognition changed their plan. They now had evidence that the archpriest orchestrated the counts. He manipulated the tali. The novice, voice thin, he made some counts twice and others disappear. The researcher tapped a folded page. Show me where. The novice unfolded the vellum and exposed a sequence of numbers alongside a list of names. The researcher counted the strokes and matched them to the archpriest's symbol. The act of tracing hand to mark made the betrayal concrete. They worked with rapid, nervous efficiency. The novice read aloud phrases, while the researcher wrote clean copies in his own notebook, pressing pen to paper so the ink would settle. Each discovery was an external event, a revealed line, a hidden cipher, a torn stitch of binding. Every 5 minutes brought a new action. At one point, a distant shout above the ground snapped their heads up. The sounds of the archpriest's congregation gathering moved like a measured drum. The researcher listened, then closed the lantern. They needed witnesses. The novice argued for immediate exposure to the congregation. The researcher pushed back. If we march with these fragments, they will burn the book and us both, he said. The novice's hand tightened on the prayer beads until the string strained. Dialogue here shaped choices. 3 short exchanges where the novice pleaded, and the researcher negotiated. We must show them the counts. The novice insisted, not in that chapel. The researcher countered. In a place where they cannot burn the codex without proof. Their voices were low. They spoke with short sentences and named each other often. They agreed to force the archpriest into spectacle on his own terms. The researcher chose to let the archpriest summon a public rite and then turn that rite into a reckoning. Their plan: plant the remaining fragments where the archpriest would find them during the public ceremony and have the senior acolyte confront him. It relied on trust, an ally among the order who had access to the altar. That was the risk. Would the senior acolyte betray them, or would he reveal the manipulated counts? The public reckoning came at dusk. The nave filled with hooded congregants who stood at a measured distance as the archpriest mounted the central steps. Candles were banked and the high nave swallowed sound so that every spoken syllable settled into the stone. The archpriest pronounced a prayer of purification that read like a summons. He raised his iron staff and the congregation bowed. The novice stood near the choir with a fragment of folio hidden within his tunic, the researcher in the back with the satchel open and ready. The archpriest spoke of impurity and theft, and when he named the novice, the hall reacted with a sound like someone closing a great gate. Novice scribe, the archpriest intoned. Pointing with his staff, you have stolen the book and betrayed us all. The novice's mouth opened, and he made no speech. The researcher stepped forward and set his satchel on a stone bench, opened it, and let the page glint in candlelight. These are your notes, the researcher said, voice clear enough to reach the first rows. He pulled out the clean copy and laid it on the bench. The archpriest's face did not change. He reached a gloved hand toward the page, and then, unexpectedly, the senior acolyte moved. The senior acolyte cleared his throat and walked to the altar with his own packet of papers folded into his robe. He stopped midway and stood between the archpriest and the novice. You speak of theft, he called, but what have you done with the counts? The archpriest's eyes slit. Do you challenge me, acolyte? He asked. The acolyte did not answer immediately. He unfolded his hands and placed a tali strip on the altar. I kept a record, he said. I counted what you asked me to count. These numbers do not match your public totals. That intervention was the second emotional shift. Hope rose where there had been only dread. The congregation murmured. The archpriest, your work show them, he said, forcing the command to sound like confidence. The acolyte held the tally up and named the differences aloud, matching names to counts and showing where entries had been doubled or erased. The archpriest's forced calm cracked into a small, controlled anger. A rapid back and forth began that fit the requirement for argument intensity. 3 to 6 sharp lines traded between the archpriest and the senior acolyte, with the novice and researcher interjecting, "You falsified this." The acolyte, "No." The archpriest answered, "I corrected ritual errors. You multiplied dread to enforce obedience." The acolyte, "You would have us fear ourselves. That is nonsense." The archpriest replied. The words were short. Names were used. "Acolyte, you know the rules," he said. "Novice, show them what you carried," the acolyte demanded. The novice went to the altar, unwrapped his cloth, and laid down the exposed folio. A hush arrived and held. The congregation leaned forward. Cloth and leather made a little sound. The archpriest reached out, then stilled. The ritual staff in his hand creaked, and an ash-gray line of wax fell from a melted candle nearby onto the stone. Then the ritual tore inward. The archpriest forced the final consecration. He intoned a phrase designed to bind the tolly to the congregation's hearts. But his staff fractured at the point he struck the altar. The sound was sharp, metal splitting against stone. A tremor ran through the nave. People gasped and backs hit benches. Panic spread not as metaphor but as a line of physical actions. Hands flew to throats, footsteps stamped toward the doors. A woman shoved past a pew and a child began to cry loudly. The researcher lunged for the satchel. He moved between falling chairs and grasped at the leather strap as the floor turned into a surface of bodies. He felt a hand, cold, iron-smelling, grab his wrist and then let go. He yanked the satchel and ran. The novice shoved a loose folio into his own sleeve, stumbled, and then was caught by the senior acolyte, who pulled him under a side arch and pressed his palm into the young man's shoulder. "Run." The researcher said to the novice, "Leave with me." Now they pushed through a back door into alleys where moonlight slashed at wet cobbles. The archpriest's shouts chased them. The sound of a congregation moving, orders barked, boots on stone, gave a rhythm to the chase. They reached the cloister and slumped against a cold wall. The researcher checked the satchel. Only fragments remained inside. He counted them quickly by touch, fingers brushing vellum edges. In the hours after, they split the work. The novice tended to wounded who had fled the chapel. Cuts, fainted backs, a sprained ankle, while the researcher catalogued the fragments in a dim study. The senior acolyte organized the survivors. His voice to them was crisp, every instruction short and named. Bring water, close the east gate. 2 searchers to the infirmary. He did not fade away after his challenge. Instead he coordinated. That practical command showed loyalty that shifted the congregation's allegiance away from the archpriest. The plot twist came in a small, specific revelation. Among the fragments the researcher found an annotation in the senior acolyte's hand, not the archpriestess, that indicated the acolyte had been keeping his own count for months. He had kept a tally to watch the archpriest, not to support him. The researcher confronted him with the page. "You kept this record because you suspected manipulation." The researcher asked. The acolyte's face did not flinch. "I could not watch them fold fear into power without proof," he said. The revelation changed the researcher's understanding of the earlier events. The acolyte had not only exposed the archpriest, but had been a hidden ally within the order. The archpriest, meanwhile, was left broken in the nave. Witnesses his staff split and he collapsed forward on his knees. Others said he screamed. The researcher only believed what he could measure, wax flecked on the altar, a fragment of staff iron with a ritual glyph broken at its tip. The senior acolyte and a council of shaken congregants decided to secure the monastery's records and determine what would be done. They argued in terse lines. Burn the codex, preserve it and study, lock it away, publish the method so it cannot be hidden again. Each sentence pushed action. The final decision was made not by a single speech, but through a set of concrete acts. The senior acolyte handed the researcher a key and a guarded instruction. Catalogue what you can. Keep the rest from the public eye until a tribunal reviews it. The researcher accepted the key and a small bundle of folios. He tied the bundle into cloth and slid it into his satchel. The novice watched him pack and then reached out and touched the satchel strap. The chapter's last sequence moved from chaos to small, definite motions. The novice and the occult researcher left the monastery through a rear gate at dawn, moving with a slow precision. They walked to a narrow house the researcher rented in the town's oldest lane. Inside, he laid the folios on his study table, set a brass compass beside them, and placed his spectacles atop the cloth. He catalogued each page by direct action. Number line, ink color, margin symbol. He wrote a short entry for the senior acolyte's record and another for the fragments that had the archpriest's hand. There was no ceremony in his work, only measured choices. He chose which pages to copy, which to seal. He decided not to reproduce the ritual's most explicit procedural lines. Instead, he recorded method outlines that would warn scholars without replicating the rite. That choice, protecting the method by withholding dangerous detail, was his final moral decision in this chapter and resolved the immediate conflict. The manipulated tali would not be used again tomorrow by the archpriest. Days later, the monastery changed. The archpriest was removed from public office. The senior acolyte supervised a provisional council. Some of the congregation left. Others stayed and argued about fidelity and fear. The novice recovered physically and spent hours copying safer sections of the codex under the researcher's supervision. Their relationship shifted. Suspicion gave way to guarded trust. Fear gave way to a steady, purpose-driven resolve. The researcher made one last entry in the catalogue and then acted. He slid the most damning folio into a leather-bound packet, tied it with waxed cord, and locked it inside the satchel beneath the spectacles. He placed the satchel on the table, closed the study door, and turned the old key in the lock once. There was no speech about meaning or fate. The chapter closed on that action, a specific movement that sealed what could be sealed and left one tali undone. The central method, its procedure, its full text, remained between them and the locked satchel. The researcher set the satchel beneath the desk, straightened his spectacles on his nose, and then crossed the room to the shuttered window where he watched the monastery roofs as the sun rose. The last line of the chapter is the latched key turning and the study door clicking shut.